In March 1998, a 10-year-old girl named Natascha Kampusch was walking to school in Vienna, Austria, when a man grabbed her, bundled her into a white minivan, and drove her to a house in Strasshof, a quiet suburb 20 kilometers outside the city, where he hid her behind a cupboard in a concrete-reinforced, soundproofed, windowless room measuring 5 square meters beneath his garage, and kept her there for 3,096 days. During those 8 years, Austrian police launched one of the largest missing person searches in the country's history, checked hundreds of white minivans across the Vienna area, and actually interviewed the man who had taken her, Wolfgang Pricklopil, a 36-year-old communications technician who owned a white minivan and lived in Strasshof, but released him without suspicion and moved on. He beat Natasha up to 200 times a week, starved her, shaved her head, and on one occasion beat her so hard she heard her own spine crack. He told her that her parents had refused to pay a ransom and did not want her back. He forbade her from crying because he was worried the salt in her tears would damage his floor tiles. As years passed, he allowed her into the main part of the house and made her cook and clean for him. He took her on short trips outside, always warning her that if she tried to get help, he would kill her. On one of those trips, an Austrian police officer stopped their car at a routine checkpoint. Natasha made eye contact with him, trying to communicate that something was wrong. The officer looked away and waved them through. On the afternoon of August 23, 2006, Pricklopil told Natasha to vacuum his car in the garden. He walked away from the noise to answer his mobile phone. Natasha left the vacuum running, walked out of the garden, ran through neighboring streets, asking strangers for help, and eventually reached the home of a woman named Inge, who called police. Natascha Kampusch was 18 years old. She had been missing for 8 years and 19 days. Hours after her escape, Wolfgang Pricklopil threw himself under a train and died. When Natasha heard that he was dead, she wept. She has since written a book about her experience called 3,096 Days, purchased and now owns the house in Strasshof where she was held, and has stated publicly that her relationship with Pricklopil was more complex than the world wanted it to be. Welcome to Buried Verdict, where we dig up the cases the world forgot and give them the story they deserve. Tonight we are going to Vienna, Austria, 1998. And we are going to meet a little girl who spent 3,096 days in a room the size of a bathroom and came out the other side still standing. Vienna in 1998 was a city of nearly 2 million people, the capital of Austria and one of the most livable cities in Europe, a place of wide boulevards, public trams, and the particular orderly safety of a Central European capital that had spent the post-war decades building a reputation for stability and security. The district of Donaustadt in the northeast of the city, where Natascha Kampusch lived with her mother Brigitte Cerny, was a residential neighborhood of apartment buildings and school routes, and the ordinary morning rhythms of families getting their children out the door on time. On the morning of March 2nd, 1998, Natasha was walking that route alone. She was 10 years old, born February 17th, 1988, the daughter of a separated couple, Brigitte and Ludwig Koch, who had not yet divorced, but were no longer together. She was a small, serious child who she would reveal years later in her memoir had been considering running away from home on that very morning because of tension in her household. She was carrying her school bag. She was wearing her coat. Wolfgang Pricklopil had been waiting. Wolfgang Pricklopil was born on May 14th, 1962, in Vienna, the only child of Karl and Waltraud Pricklopil. He grew up in Strasshof an der Nordbahn, a small town of about 8,000 people, 20 kilometers northeast of the Austrian capital, the kind of unremarkable suburban community that exists around every major European city, full of modest houses, small gardens, and people who go to work in the morning and come home in the evening. He trained as a communications technician and worked for Siemens. He was never married. He had no children. He owned a house on Heinestrasse in Strasshof that had belonged to his grandmother, a 2-story property with a garage, a garden, and a cellar beneath the garage that no one outside that house had ever seen. His neighbors described him as quiet, unremarkable, friendly enough, polite, the kind of man you wave to in the morning without thinking much about. He had a close friend named Ernst Holzapfel who visited the house regularly. He had no criminal record. He drove a white minivan for work. He was, in every visible respect, an ordinary man living an ordinary life in a quiet Austrian town. But what was happening inside that house was not ordinary. Because for years before March 2nd, 1998, Wolfgang Pschicklopil had been building something beneath his garage. He had been constructing a room with a door of concrete reinforced with steel, 7 centimeters thick. A room that was soundproofed with no windows and no natural light. A room measuring 5 square meters, roughly the size of a large bathroom, with a ceiling height of 1.80 meters. A room accessible only through a heavy wooden cupboard that weighed approximately 150 kilograms and was pushed against the wall of the garage to conceal the entrance entirely. He built this room over a period of years. He did not build it to store tools or wine. He built it for a specific purpose. And on the morning of March 2nd, 1998, he drove his white minivan into the Donaustadt district of Vienna to put that purpose into effect. On the morning of the 2nd of March, 1998, Natasha was walking that route alone. She was 10 years old, born the 17th of February, 1988, the daughter of a separated couple, Brigitte and Ludwig Koch, who had not yet divorced but were no longer together. She was a small, serious child who, she would reveal years later in her memoir, had been considering running away from home on that very morning because of tension in her household. She was carrying her school bag, she was wearing her coat. Natascha Kampusch left her home on Rennbahnweg that morning for a route she had walked many times before. The difference on that particular morning was that she was walking alone. Her friend, who usually accompanied her to school, had a cold and was staying home. Wolfgang Pschicklopil had been waiting. Natasha was on the Mailingasse when Pschicklopil approached her. She later described the moment in her memoir. He came towards her, grabbed her, and bundled her into his white van. She tried to scream, but found she could not make a sound. She was hidden under a blanket in the back of the vehicle during the 20-kilometer drive to Strasshof. When the van stopped and the doors opened, she was inside the garage on Heinestrasse. The cupboard was moved. The concrete door was opened. She was taken down into the room Pschicklopil had built for her. The door closed. The cupboard was pushed back into place. Natascha Kampusch was 10 years old. She would not see the outside world again for 8 years, 1 month, and 21 days. Austria responded to her disappearance with one of the largest missing person searches in the country's history. Natasha's mother, Brigitte Cerny, and her father, Ludwig Koch, who had separated but not yet divorced, appeared on television pleading for information. Tens of thousands of posters bearing Natasha's photograph were distributed across Vienna and the surrounding region. Police investigated more than 700 leads. The government offered a reward of tens of millions of shillings for information leading to her whereabouts. A young witness who had been near the Mailingasse that morning told police she had seen Natasha being taken toward a white minivan. Austrian police began a systematic check of white minivans across the Vienna area, an enormous logistical undertaking that eventually covered hundreds of vehicles and their owners. Among the owners of white minivans who were interviewed by police in those early days was a communications technician from Strasshof named Wolfgang Pschicklopil. Officers visited his home on Heinestrasse. They looked at his minivan. They spoke with him. He had no criminal record. He was cooperative. He was described as well-groomed and polite. They found nothing suspicious, did not search the interior of his property thoroughly, and eliminated him from their inquiries. Natascha Kampusch was at that moment locked inside a room 5 meters from where those officers were standing. That is the fact that Natasha herself has returned to in interview after interview in the years since her escape. She has said it directly and without softening it. If the police had conducted a thorough search of Pschicklopil's property on Heinestrasse in March 1998, they would have found her within days of her disappearance. The room was there. The evidence of its construction was there. She was there on the other side of a wall, in a town 20 kilometers from Vienna, while her face was on posters across the Capitol and her parents were pleading on national television. The search continued for months and then for years, producing nothing. And eventually the investigation diminished to what cold cases always diminish to: an open file, periodic reviews, and the particular unanswered grief of two parents who no longer lived together, who had nothing left to share except the absence of their daughter. Inside Heinestrasse, Natascha's life in those first years was almost entirely confined to 5 square meters. Priklopil brought her food, clothing, and books. She had a small television at some point. She educated herself through reading because there was nothing else to do with the hours that accumulated in that room without natural light, without a window, without any way to measure time, except by the rhythm of his visits. He was her only human contact. He was the only voice she heard. He was the only presence in her world. And he used that absolute monopoly on her reality with deliberate and systematic intent to break her down. He beat her with regularity that she described in her memoir as up to 200 times a week. He starved her for periods and then controlled what she ate. He physically and sexually abused her. He beat her on one occasion until she heard her own spine crack. He forbade her from crying, she said, because he was concerned that the salt in her tears would damage the tiling in the room. When she cried, despite that prohibition, he grabbed her by the neck and forced her head under a tap. He had her hair shaved off. He made her wear a plastic bag over her head while cleaning to prevent her hair from falling on the floor. He was obsessive about cleanliness and punished her when she left fingerprints on surfaces. He manacled her to him while they slept. And alongside all of that, he conducted a psychological campaign that Natasha has described as sustained and calculated. He told her that her parents had refused to pay a ransom. He told her they were happy to be rid of her. He told her they did not love her and did not want her back. He told her that the outside world had forgotten her, that no one was looking, that the life she had left on the Melangos that morning had simply closed over her absence and moved on. He wanted her to understand that her survival depended entirely on him, that he was the only thing standing between her and a world that had discarded her, and that the only rational response to that reality was gratitude and compliance. Natasha did not comply entirely. She resisted in the ways that were available to her. She educated herself. She maintained her identity in the interior space he could not reach. She named herself in her own mind as a person separate from what he was doing to her. That act of internal resistance, sustained over 8 years, is what made the escape possible when the opportunity finally came. As the years passed, Priklopil allowed her limited access to the upper part of the house. He put her to work cooking and cleaning for him, which extended her world from 5 square meters to the dimensions of a house, still under his complete control, but physically larger than the room beneath the garage. He took her on short trips with him to run errands, always making clear before they left that he would kill her if she attempted to attract attention or ask for help. She did not disbelieve him. She had spent years understanding exactly what he was capable of. On one of those outings, Austrian police stopped the vehicle they were traveling in at a routine checkpoint. Natasha was in the car with the man who had taken her from the Melangos 8 years earlier. She made eye contact with the officer who approached the driver's window. She held that eye contact in the way a person does when they are trying to communicate something urgent through the only means available to them. The officer did not act. He checked whatever he needed to check and waved the vehicle through. Natasha has reflected on that moment at the checkpoint in interviews since her escape and said she was not able to speak because Priklopil was right there and she knew what would happen if she did. The eye contact was the only signal she could send. The officer did not read it. On the afternoon of the 23rd of August 2006, Natascha Kampusch was 18 years old and had been in captivity for 8 years, 1 month, and 21 days. Priklopil told her to vacuum his car in the garden of the Heinestrasse property. She began vacuuming. At some point during that task, His mobile phone rang. He stepped away from the car to take the call, moving to a position where the sound of the vacuum partially masked their separation. Natascha Kampusch left the vacuum running. She walked out of the garden. She moved through the neighboring properties. She approached several people on the street and asked for help. Some of them did not respond in a way that assisted her. She kept moving. She eventually reached the home of a woman named Inge, who opened the door, understood what she was being told, and called the police. When Natasha arrived at a police station in the nearby town of Deutsch-Wagram, there was a question that had to be answered before anything else could happen. Who was she? She had changed so significantly in 8 years that identification was not immediate. She had not grown much. She was thin. She looked different from the 10-year-old girl in the photographs that had been posted across Austria in 1998. DNA testing was used to confirm her identity. The result confirmed what she had told police. She was Natascha Kampusch. She had been missing for 3,096 days. Her mother, Brigitte Cerny, received the phone call that she had spent 8 years no longer believing would come. When they were reunited, Brigitte later said, "We fell into each other's arms." I recognized her from her way of being, her face. Natasha's parents, who had divorced during the year she was missing, both learned simultaneously that their daughter was alive. While that reunion was happening, Wolfgang Priklopil called his friend Ernst Holzapfel. He told Holzapfel that he had done something very bad. Holzapfel told him to turn himself in. That evening, Priklopil went to Vienna's Praterstern station. At 8:57 p.m., on the 23rd of August, 2006, he threw himself under a train. He was 44 years old. He died at the station. When Natasha was told that Wolfgang Priklopil was dead, she wept. That response shocked Austria and most of the watching world. It was immediately framed as evidence of Stockholm Syndrome, the psychological phenomenon in which a captive develops emotional bonds with their captor. Commentators, journalists, and television presenters spent days and weeks analyzing what her tears meant, what they said about her mental state, whether they were evidence of pathology or of something else entirely. Her mother later told reporters that Natasha carried a photograph of Priklopil's coffin. Natasha has addressed this directly and repeatedly in the years since. She has said that her relationship with Priklopil across 8 years of isolation in a 5 square meter room was not reducible to a 3-word psychological label. She was the only human being he was in contact with for most of that period. He was the only human being she was in contact with. The emotional reality of that is not simple, and she has refused to allow a simplification that, she has argued, serves the comfort of people who want a clean narrative more than it serves the truth of her actual experience. She has said she does not define herself as a victim. She defines herself as a survivor. In the immediate aftermath of Priklopil's death, Austrian investigators faced a question that the inquiry had to answer before it could be considered complete. Had Priklopil acted alone? A young witness had originally described seeing 2 people at the scene of the abduction on the Mellengasse in 1998. Priklopil's friend Ernst Holzapfel, who had visited the Heinestrasse property regularly during all the years Natasha was held there, was investigated as a possible accomplice. He was questioned. His connection to Priklopil was examined in detail. He was cleared. The question of accomplices remained publicly unsettled enough that the Austrian parliament commissioned a new investigation in 2012, bringing in the German Federal Criminal Police Office, the BKA, and investigators from the FBI to review the case alongside Austrian authorities. That 9-month international inquiry was presented in April 2013. Its conclusion, presented by German investigator Jörg Zierke, was that there was a high degree of certainty that Priklopil had carried out the kidnapping alone. DNA samples taken from the Heinestrasse property returned no evidence of another suspect. The theory that Priklopil may have been murdered rather than dying by suicide was also examined and dismissed. Natasha herself had always maintained that Priklopil acted alone. The international inquiry confirmed her account. Natascha Kampusch now owns the house on Heinestrasse in Strasshof where she was held. She purchased it. She has said it is hers, and that she has a right to it after what was done to her within it. She published her memoir, 3,096 Days, in 2010. The book was an international bestseller and was adapted into a feature film released in 2013. She hosted her own Austrian television talk show. She has given hundreds of interviews. She has spoken at conferences on child safety and missing persons. She was 38 years old in 2026. She lives in Vienna. She has also been consistently critical of the Austrian investigation of 1998 and the years that followed. She has said explicitly that the police failure in those early days of the investigation, the failure to search the Heinestrasse property when Priklopil was first interviewed as the owner of a white minivan, was a failure that cost her 8 years of her childhood and her adolescence. She was there. The room was there. The search had identified white minivans as the relevant vehicle and had the name of the man who owned one and lived 20 kilometers from the abduction site within the first weeks of the investigation. What was not done in those early weeks is a question that the Austrian government, the police, and anyone responsible for child safety policy in that country has been required to answer in every subsequent inquiry about this case. The Natascha Kampusch case carries specific lessons that extend far beyond Austria and far beyond 1998. The first lesson is about witness credibility in missing person cases. The young witness who saw Natasha being taken described a white minivan. That description was accurate and ultimately pointed directly to Priklopil. The same witness later described 2 men rather than 1, which introduced doubt into the investigation and contributed years of confusion to the question of accomplices. When a witness is the primary source of information in a missing person case, the initial account, given closest in time to the event, deserves the most weight, and the physical evidence, the minivan, the location, the timing, deserves to be followed to its conclusion, including thorough searches of properties connected to that evidence, not just interviews with their owners. The second lesson is about thoroughness in the critical early hours and days of an investigation. Priklopil was interviewed. His minivan was examined. He was found to have no criminal record and to behave in a cooperative and calm manner. He was eliminated as a suspect without a search of the interior of his property. Natasha was already in the room beneath his garage. The connection between initial interview and thorough investigation is not optional in a case involving the disappearance of a child. The absence of a criminal record is not evidence of innocence. Calm cooperative behavior during a police interview is not evidence of innocence. Only a search establishes what is actually on a property. The third lesson is one that Natasha herself has spoken to directly. The complexity of what a person who has survived long-term captivity and psychological manipulation feels in the aftermath of that experience is not reducible to a single clinical term. When survivors of extreme situations behave in ways that do not match what an outside observer expects, the correct response is to listen to the survivor's own account of their experience, rather than to apply a label that forecloses the conversation. Natascha Kampusch spent 8 years with one person. The emotional reality of that cannot be understood from the outside in the first 24 hours after an escape. It requires time, and it requires listening to the person who lived it. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to Buried Verdict so you do not miss the next case. Every name behind these files deserves to be told, and your presence here is the reason we continue to tell them. Natascha Kampusch was 10 years old when Wolfgang Priklopil grabbed her on the Mellengasse on a Monday morning in March 1998 and drove her to a room beneath his garage that she would not leave for 3,096 days. She educated herself in that room. She survived in that room. She maintained herself as a person in that room when everything around her was designed to make that impossible. She left a vacuum running in a garden on an August afternoon and ran. She is 38 years old and she owns the house. She told the story in her own words and in her own time. She was a 10-year-old girl carrying a school bag on a street in Vienna. She was always more than what was done to her. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. See you in the next one.